that was part one of a two-part session. Prior to the break, we had Barbara van der Linden present Laboratorium, and I think it's impossible to think about certainly the laboratory without thinking about research. And so we then go from research to research and development. And I think this kind of provocative idea that, again, it goes without thinking that corporations, companies would have R&D departments, but it's not a term we tend to think of certainly within the art world. I mean, obviously within aspects of the cultural industry you would, but perhaps precisely framed as the culture industry, rather than something more ethereal and which is the tendency we sometimes have to ingratiate ourselves with when we're talking about the art world. What we wanted to do now was kind of continue this vector, particularly in relation to the response, the kind of response of the inherited and perhaps wished for responsibilities that contemporary art institutions feel that they have, or ought to have, or maybe not have. As a little bit of context before I introduce my next two guests, about 20 years ago, there was what has been called an educational turn certainly within the art world and the kind of art theory world. And I sort of wondered to myself, why might this have happened? A few kind of possible theories as to why this might be the case. One requires us to zoom out even further across time and space, perhaps even back to the era of the Bauhaus, and maybe even sort of 6 years before that. Let's say whenever Marcel Duchamp presented his first ready-made, or certainly then the famous fountain. There's a way of, I think, talking about what happens to art in the 20th century, whereby art becomes less and less self-explanatory, and in a sense becomes increasingly opaque, and does not reveal itself, what it is, what it means, purely by the kind of visual relationship. And what this does, therefore, is, I think, then initiate a whole kind of history of interpretive infrastructure. And so the art critic, of course, and someone like Clement Greenberg, I think, is a paradigm of this. Without Clement Greenberg, what the hell is a Mark Rothko painting? Or a Barnett Newman zip line, right? So there's almost, and of course, particularly with the abstract expressionists, there's a kind of mystical element to them. And so there's almost a sense in which the art critic becomes a kind of prophet figure that shuttles between mortals and something like a godly message. But then now, can you imagine going to a museum and not having the booklet, not having the wall text, not having the press release that would have come out a few weeks before the show opens? All of this interpretive infrastructure arguably wouldn't have to be there if the art, quote unquote, could speak for itself. So I would argue that and so I think education fits also within this kind of interpretive infrastructure, and particularly, let's say, when one is dealing with quote-unquote difficult work. The second thing I would mention, of course, is economics. And if an institution is still lucky enough to be majority public funded, then often that funding will come with some very straightforward conditions, and one of those conditions would be something like a public educational program, because that, and I would argue that is a very direct way of quantifying moral public good. And again, especially if the work that's being shown, that's being funded, let's say by a state, is, again, of a difficult nature that doesn't speak for itself. And then a question that we can think about and talk about also in the next sort of 45 minutes is whether private institutions feel that they have the same requirement, and if they don't, do they increasingly choose to have that requirement rather than, again, inalienably possess it as a kind of inbuilt function. And my last thing would be a little thought experiment. Imagine a museum opens and it has, has a very good cafe with very good coffee. It has the right kind of bookshop where you get panic attack when you go in because you want to buy everything. It has a fantastic rooftop garden, and it has an expensive restaurant that gives you a lot of FOMO because it has the right view over the right river, etc. But it has no education program, right? It has no education program. This museum has got all this amazing stuff, but it has no education program. Would you think less of such a museum? So that's just to kind of get us started with the conversation. Two amazing guests and also close friends and allies, Antonia Carver and Elvira Dyangani. I'm going to introduce Antonia first. Many of you will not need an introduction about Antonia Carver. She's, of course, the director of Art Jameel, which opened merely months ago, back in November, at the Creek in Dubai. But the Jameel, Art Jameel is also a much bigger entity with many kind of branches of activity, of which we're going to hear about in a minute. But you'll also, those of you attending the Global Art Forum for years will know that Antonia was the artistic director here at Art Dubai, but even more personally was the person with whom this iteration and this idea of the Global Art Forum was kind of dreamt up together. And I think I mention it because in a sense the Global Art Forum is an education program, but one that doesn't refer to itself as one. Rather, it sort of smuggles that mandate, but through other formats or a search for another format. And maybe that's something we can talk about as well. So will you please join me in welcoming Antonia Carver. Thank you.
Thanks, Shimon, and thanks everybody for being here and for inviting me. And it's great to sit with Elvira. We've been in juries together and had lots of conversations, so it's great to continue it here. Thank you. Shimon, you asked us to... first of all, I should say that when we met before, we kind of ripped up everything we were going to talk about and started all over again. And then everybody else has been so inspiring that I've ended up with a load of notes that I can barely kind of understand because there's so many scribbles of things that we should talk about.
Hans Ulrich would be proud of you.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Total chaos.
I don't know whether anybody can help me here, but I can barely read it. But I'll try. So you asked us to look a lot at context, which I think is absolutely crucial, and to sort of unpick why arts education matters, or why it falls to the arts institution to become this kind of quasi-university. And I was thinking a little bit about this whole nature of public and private. We can maybe come back to that, but also the way in which the institution or the museum of today almost has taken on this kind of public service broadcasting kind of mandate alongside the art. Kind of reminded of the early days of the BBC, for example, where, the mandate was to educate, inform, and entertain, and you could almost kind of think that museums are kind of demanded to take on that role now too. And then what Victoria highlighted at the beginning about this definition of school as a place of leisure, I kind of thought, well, the museum is a kind of place of leisure and a school, so that's kind of almost come full circle from that early kind of definition. I thought I should maybe just touch very quickly on 3 different programs. So one would be Campus Art Dubai. And for any the uninitiated to Campus Art Dubai, they have this year's iteration has projects here right next door in this hall, so please do go and see them. And then the second, to talk a little bit about the Jameel Houses of Traditional Arts in Jeddah and Cairo. and then to come on to the Jamil Art Centre. So I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to race. So with Campus Art Dubai, this was something that we dreamt up at Art Dubai in 2013, and it partly came from this kind of impetus of thinking, and actually it came from a lot of people that we work with, a lot of people based in the UAE, who kind of came and said, look, everything happens in March, and you have this fantastic Global Art Forum, if we're going to kind of pat ourselves on the back. But what about the rest of the year? Now, we can sort of continue this conversation? And also kind of came from an earlier iteration of workshops we did when we were with Bidoon, looking at kind of critical thinking and art writing, and realizing that these kind of workshops can not only bring artists together and enable them to develop their work further post-school in a kind of critical environment, but also kind of create community, which then becomes self-sustaining and creates a kind of sense of ongoing support for each other that's peer-led. And also we were obviously inspired by Homeworks Academy in Beirut and Mass Alexandria and a few other kind of examples of itinerant schools that were coming up through the region. And many people in the audience were very involved. I mean, Tirdad was the director of the second edition, Shimon, you were involved, Aaron Cesar, the team at Art Dubai at that time, Lanshanzi, Hala, Ali, Natasha Corella, we were all sort of involved in brainstorming this concept. And then Murtaza Vali and Uzma Rizvi took it on from the third edition and are still the directors today. And it was really this kind of idea of also how can you think from the ground up. You know, we were aware that the UAE was looking at perhaps importing models of art schools from elsewhere. Running parallel to that was that a lot of people from here would go to study in art schools abroad because there weren't the art schools here at that time. So they would have that sort of double whammy of coming back from being based in another city to set up here, plus kind of societal expectations about what they might do with their degrees, and they kind of were in a little bit of a vacuum. So how to kind of address that, and how to really kind of think about a school that could be acutely relevant to its context. So I think it was Uzma that came up with, I mean, the title of one of the sessions was Turbulent Waters and Shifting Sands, and that was the kind of 6-month kind of theme that we were looking at. So really kind of thinking, you know, everything shifting underneath our feet and how to create kind of context around that and learn from each other sort of from the ground up. And we were very broad in our approach and in terms of who the kind of lecturers were and who came in and out. And I think also kind of through that, I mean, I loved the last presentation talking about R&D labs, because actually now with Art Jameel as well, we talk a lot about R&D and R&D kind of with the artist and how to sort of create institutions together through conversations. I mean, we're all in this. We're only 3 months old, so we're totally kind of utopian and want to change the world. Maybe we'll become cynical at some point. But anyway, we're still hanging on to that. And Campus Art Dubai, I felt, really did sort of look a lot at that. So what is it to live and work as an artist in the GCC? What is the context of which we're making work in the UAE? And to kind of use that to then every iteration of the school kind of built on the last one and sort of kind of cycled that learning. Then the next kind of little example is the Jameel Houses of Traditional Arts. This comes under Art Jameel, where I work now, and we have one in Jeddah and one in Cairo. And this is kind of, if CAD was a kind of education as community, this is more kind of education as kind of preservation and recovery, if you like. So really looking at the traditional art forms that were very prevalent. Each school is located in the old city of each city, and kind of really looking at the architecture and the heritage that's all around and trying to sort of re-look again and build some urgency into preserving the actual skills of craft. And so the students, there's a 2-year diploma in Cairo, a 1-year diploma in Jeddah, and the participants or students kind of really look in depth at working in ceramics, in geometry, in Islamic design, and kind of building their practices from that. And, you know, and in some cases we've ended up sort of working with craftspeople in the city. So in Cairo, we just started a new track on glass blowing and working with Cairo's glass blowers who are, you know, very diminished in number, but there's still people there that work in the studios. So kind of re-injecting life back into those skills and sort of having that trade. Of course, there's a real kind of tension. 5 minutes, okay. There's a real tension between the preservation idea or the preservation model and the contemporary application, but we try to really kind of play on that and you know, embrace it, that tension, and sort of build from there. And also now increasingly kind of taking what we learn through the the teaching in the schools and the reaction and what the students are producing, to then apply that to kind of real life situations, if you like. So in Jeddah, for example, the students are now starting to work on preserving the houses that are around them in the Balad, which are kind of falling apart. So rather than sort of produce factory kind of produced elements of the buildings that are falling apart, they're doing this from hand and therefore deeply engaging with their kind of local environment. And then in perhaps more kind of a sort of more in-depth sort of application, we've started, for example, from the teaching and what we've learned in the school, to apply that to projects out in the field. So at the moment we have a project with Forensic Architecture, the V&A and Yazda, looking at the tools that Yazidi refugees returning to their lands can use to preserve or to rebuild what they've lost. So that's not only a community project, obviously it's also about really creating new spaces in which to kind of survive. So there's a certain kind of urgency to what's happening there. And then that goes back to sort of what Maud was talking about in terms of integration. I didn't realise that we had all these kind of, I don't know, maybe we're doing Bauhaus Saudi style or something, I don't know, but we didn't know, but we were doing that, but maybe we are. And then maybe we could start the slides now, because the slides, just on a quick slideshow, relate to what the next bit, which is just to touch on what we're doing now at the Jamil Art Centre, which is, as Shimon mentioned, 3-month-old institution. They can just roll, if that's okay. Built on the creek in Dubai, and anyone that hasn't been, I urge you to come and see us. We'd love to have you. And particularly maybe just to reference a little bit the education programming, and Unskatan and Nadine Andor are here in the audience, and they should really be saying all this because they run the library and the research and learning department at Jamil Art Centre, and we've really kind of, that is very much our laboratory, I think we'd say, as an organisation. So we do all the things that museums are supposed to do, you know, schools visits, family workshops, I guess, all that kind of thing. And, you know, and sort of a lot of talks programs. We probably have a talk every week, lots of different models from artists, sort of peer review, critique sessions in the library, through to more kind of traditional arts forms. We kind of also have a youth assembly, which I think is really particularly exciting, run by Murad Al-Ghazal, who might be here as well, I'm not sure, but and that's a group of 18 to 25-year-olds, 9 of them who do their own programming. They're taking over the centre on April the 26th, and we've kind of said, right, carte blanche, make it your own, invite your friends, you know, kind of investigate what it is. And that's a form of learning as well. It's a kind of another kind of, you know, 9-month program, a little bit like CAD, but kind of very peer-led. Completely. And I guess we were sort of, you know, interested in this idea from the beginning of thinking in public and of taking, which I guess is another word for this R&D lab kind of idea, and really looking in depth at what artists are doing in terms of their research and bringing that out into a public sphere. So that can be something historical. We had one lab that looked at the early 80s UAE and kind of, you know, sort of, I guess, brought that research right out into a public sphere. We asked the public if they want to come in, or people that were familiar with that history, to come in and actually sort of change on the walls where they felt they disagreed with who was important, who wasn't, and sort of rewrite the history in real time through the exhibition. At the moment, we have a fantastic kind of experimental show by Rand Abdel-Jabbar, which is looking at a minaret in Anna in Iraq, and the sort of, again, looking at this kind of post-conflict society, or I don't know whether we're post or not, but conflict to post, and what it takes to preserve buildings in that kind of way. And that's a new experimental format that Uns came up with, which is to sort of take the artist's research, put it up on the walls, kind of just let it explode, invite others to engage with it, and at the end of that 3-week process, then do a talk, sort of looking back at this process of thinking in public. I had many other things to say, but I think I need to race on. I guess one of the things that, and we do a lot of reading groups, and also this idea of learning from the artist is very, very key to us. Every exhibition we do, we kind of reflect back on that process of making the exhibition and ask the artist to help us form how the institution should move forward. But I guess what I'm kind of particularly interested in, going back to this sort of idea of context, is what these projects have in common. And all of them have actually been born from privately run, in the case of the fair, totally commercial kind of contexts. And thinking that in the context of the UAE or maybe the Gulf, that this public-private model that we tend to think of in Europe, of kind of, we talked about it just before, of kind of, state funding being somehow sort of clean and commercial funding being a sort of necessary evil, how, in the context of the Gulf, where the public and private is very muddied and something quite different, that model can flip around. And within the context of the private, you can have flexibility, you can be on your toes, you can think independently, and you can hopefully build in some kind of resilience as well. So I think that's something to mention. They all are very participatory, interactive, and kind of, one thing that we've dwelled on quite a lot over the years is this idea of how exhibitions and artists' work can open up spaces for debate that maybe don't exist in other areas of life. Here not necessarily in the media, for example, but through the arts we can sort of think a lot about where we want to be and who we want to be. And for a country like here, where many people are perhaps from elsewhere but have created for themselves a stake in the UAE, that becomes quite a kind of urgent and very prevalent kind of way of thinking. And the other point is just about this kind of idea of the arts as a kind of Trojan horse to introduce other topics that are perhaps more difficult to talk about, and to have sort of exploratory debates that really explore these kind of shifts in society. I used to think this was maybe something to do with being in a young country that's very future-oriented, constantly thinking about where do we want to go and who are we and things like that. But maybe this is kind of global these days. I don't know, the UK is pretty messed up right now trying to think who they are and what they are.
Is it really?
Can you believe? But let's not mention the bro, where we're not allowed to get onto that. But anyway, it's maybe this is a kind of global moment where the arts can help us think who we are.
Thank you. I think it's a good, perfect moment to move on to Elvira. Thank you. Word.
No B word.
But maybe it'll be impossible. While we speak to our next guest, Elvira Dyangani Oze, quite recently became the director of the Showroom space in London. She's affiliated with the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths, and we've been working and thinking together for the last few years at Fondazione Prada's Thought Council in Milan. Previously, she served as senior curator at Creative Time, and she was curator of the 8th edition of the Göteborg International Biennial of Contemporary Art, and prior to that, curator of international art at Tate Modern. So will you please join me in welcoming Elvira Dyangani Oze. Thank you.
Thank you, Shimon, Victoria, Faz, Judel, and others that I helped, Fatima, I don't want to forget anybody. And of course, Antonia, as you said, we had sitting various juries, so it's great to have the chance to have this public conversation. I'll talk about many things, but I try also to screen what I had in this time. I had to say that the title, how it will come up in the conversation as we move along, but also that I wanted to perhaps say something about exhibitions. Like I said, experimental pedagogies, because this is what we're supposed to talk about today. And I could have said art institutions instead of exhibitions or art projects, right? But I decided to keep this idea of the lab and the exhibition as a device and as a tool, right? As a space for in which certain aspect of, perhaps as Barbara was saying, no, that of experimentations that are occurring in the city get highlighted through such device. No? I'm going to use this, and I'm going to start. Sorry.
The green one?
Yes. That's what I'm doing. I'm touching the green one now. There you go. Let's go back here. So basically, I just wanted to start the day celebrating a dear friend that recently died, but not only because she was incredible as a human being, but her significance in the context of pedagogy as well. No? And this book, which maybe I can pass around, is the only copy I have, and it's out of print, so please return it.
Don't pass it around.
Don't pass it around. Okay, I keep
Do
it
not
here.
pass it around.
I'll leave it here. Asiko, yes. Asiko book on the future of artistic curatorial pedagogies and art. It's one of the most precious accounts of the experience that she ran for several years in 5 African cities. And I wanted to start talking about her because of, as I said, when you were talking about context, and this will come across immediately. So although it opened in 2007, BC Silva imagined the Center for Contemporary Art Lagos, CCA Lagos, already in the 1990s, while she was a student at Royal College of Arts, and was toying with the possibility of going back to Lagos, going back to Nigeria, at the time where the scenes there was much less effervescence of what you will have, what you could experience if you travel to the city today. She wanted to create a space that will not only change her location, but that also will transform her frame of reference. No? In her formulation of such space, she wanted primarily give preference to experimental artistic practices, including a variety of media, and the possibility of their mix through a transdisciplinary mode that which she will imprint to CCA. No? The idea that will be that CCA was this curatorial laboratory, and again, some of the things that we have been discussing today come here, animated by a plethora of initiatives. And the project intervened in an arena that, although was, let's say, richly populated by local custom and vernacular culture, felt like a tabula rasa. No? And here is where the notion of context that you sort of invited us to reflect upon come in the form that she remembers in the introduction to the book of a quote by Ngugi wa Thiong'o that I'm going to read you now, where he says that and he's talking about the third world literature, and he says that knowing oneself and one's environment was the correct basis of absorbing the world, that there could never be only one center from which to view the world, but the different people in the world had their culture and their environment as a center. The relevant question was, therefore, of how one center relate to other centers. I thought I had 10 minutes. I was already gone. But since we are talking about pedagogy, I wanted to bring ASICO, and this is, as I say, the account of those years, which was one of the most caring and daring projects that VC put together in 2010, a space that I guess if we were to name experimentation in art education in Africa, that would be that. A tool of critical significance in an artist scene, a thirst of more courses and informal exchanges on critical thinking and art production that included in this second edition Artist and Curator. It started, as I said, in 2010, included 12 or 15 African artists and curators emerging, in most cases, some of which had not had an actual formal education. There were 35 days course, which included a collective faculty of international artists, art historians, curators, writers, and other cultural agents. It was a laboratory, a residency, and academy, privileging experimentation over conventional approaches to art making, criticism, and cultural inquiry. I'm not going to do what I wanted to say. I see it clearly. But that takes me to what I wanted to be, which is telling you a little bit about what I try to do in terms of such experimentation and what it means to work critically with a format which was the art exhibition. And it happens during the context of the biennial JIPCA, the Contemporary International Biennial, and a project that I did there that was called A Story Within a Story, 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 You can repeat as much as you want. So the project was concerned with the possibility of intervening and imagining history as a participatory experience. And to me, and I mean, there are many websites where you can read more about it. What perhaps was critical to me was the way in which we could take this Umberto Eco's notion of the open work as a conceptual backdrop and curatorial methodology, but also to imagine it, how history will make these subjects. No? And if you think that you can make your history to your own advantage, what will be the collective subject of history? So that was the questions that we have in our mind when I invited the collective Recetas Urbanas, an architectural studio, to build what we call it HOW, which is House of Words, which is the translation into English of the Spanish La Casa de la Palabra, which is the way, I mean, I'm originally from Equatorial Guinea, although I was born in Spain and I grew up in Spain. But the La Casa de la Palabra as a structure of exchange, storytelling, and let's say, a space of decision making was critical to my memories of Equatorial Guinea, and particularly of Ndue culture, which I was nurtured, even though I grew up in the diaspora. I lived through that experience. And I wanted to talk about it because we imagine history as a radical art, focusing on socially engaged projects. And the House of Work was the space in which we will interrogate these notions of storytelling, collective memories, and publicness from a transnational and transhistorical perspective. That questioning of what could be public or what could be transmitted through experimentation already started in the making of the space. So we decided just to say that La Casa de la Palabra or Larva Palabra, or the House of Words, sometimes it's not even a house, it's not even a structure, it could be an empty space, right? In the way in which one can imagine a clear in the forest where people sit together and reflect on issues that are important, crucial to the community. But I thought, so if I want to create a space that will respond as a parasite, you saw it here, no? It's connected to the exhibition, and that's what I was showing you guys first. This is the space of the exhibition. And, oops, I think what is, okay, I'm gonna shut up in a minute. Everybody want me to stop. Anyhow, so basically I wanted to show you, this is like a turbine hall space where the exhibition was taking place, and these two windows are the ones connected here. You can see. So Recetas Urbanas project, which has Recetas Urbanas is a translation to, so it translates in English as urban prescription, right? And every time that they formulate the project, that implies an incredible act of generosity from both the studio and each individual that take part of the project. It's transformed in a political platform where the possibility of generation of a social space is established. So I wanted to bring that, making that construction to the space that we were building. In general, Recetas Urbanas work in a way that the space that they create defies what is originally imposed by political powers or regulated by public administration. And in that respect, in this case, it becomes, let's say, a parasite to the institution, right? And this is where we celebrated most of our programming. We started the project with the formulation of the space itself, this is Santiago Cirujeda over here, who thought about the project, but then allowed for everybody participating in the project to give their opinion, to transform the space, to contribute in these spaces of discussions to the formulation of the actual physical space. We use, in most cases, recycled materials, and I say we because I also was there constructing with everybody else. The projects that they do think about architecture as a technique, as a space of experimentation, as a space for theorization, suggesting that everyday management and our urbanity, our sense of participation, our desires, our wishes can also be impressed in the architecture itself. So then the architecture becomes the mechanism, the activism, right? But this was just the first part of the project. The second part of the project was the activation of the space by artist Lulu Sherinet, where she, so here you have two interventions, the space of Santi, the stools that are from Sergela Nitigeka, an artist based in Johannesburg, who is a migrant there, who has lived through the conditions that you had to go through in order to regularize your situation, and uses these stools. He actually built these stools while he was waiting in these long and tedious lines to obtain his passport, right? And produces this for people in the public space so they could go and sit there. So I thought the way that we can contribute to bring more context to the space at the time, and this was the space in which all the, let's say, all the programs will take place, was to bring his proposals. We did all the educational program in collaboration with Public Art Agency and Balan Academy in Gothenburg, Public Art Agency Sweden, which are based in Stockholm, but they supported us in the project. And then the second part of the project, and I'm passing this quickly because it was, you had the chance before the biennial started to take the space to yourself, to come here and meditate, to listen Joaquin Koster meditative proposal, but also to use the space to your own advantage when there was no discussions. We discuss around issues on post-coloniality, participatory architecture, community and participatory politics, the museum, the art university. Very much some of the concerns that they were, let's say, spread in the space of the exhibition were presented here in a format that invited individuals, not only through their professions, but also as a human beings. Like they had to also bring some of the concern that they had as individuals. No? And the whole project, and I think I'm gone with the time. And the whole project also was important for us because we invited to use the space, but also to participate in those conversations. Some of the groups that were considered under the formulation of the what in Sweden in 2006 the Swedish Conservative Party is called authorship, right? Othership, sorry, which means like a foreignness condition, no? Like, almost like a way to officially declare second-rate citizens. And the contribution of these individuals formulated a space in which experimentations in the relationship with the institution also was formulated. Just to say, and maybe I consumed 2 minutes of my discussion, that the way that we operate, there were 70 people working on the space to produce the actual institution, let's say, no? this parasite institution, but also, I lost a couple of, I lost a couple of slides that, in a way, what I wanted to reflect upon is how much this sort of hybrid format, no? The way that Recetas Urbanas work with their architecture, and my intention is to use let's say, the space of the exhibition as a device, as a public device, that in many respects try also to change the paradigm of the institution, is something of the formulation that I'm trying to bring to an institution like the Showroom that has 35 years of history, that has an incredible legacy, that has a program, Communal Knowledge, that had been defined by my predecessor, Emily Pettit, which is very much supported critically by the community in London. No? But that we serve a local community, that we engage in projects that has, let's say, what I, in other photos I had called experience as institution.
Thank you so much, Elvira. I have 1 or 2 questions, and I'll open it up to you guys. It would be fair to say, would it not, that you are both advocates for the idea of education within an institution, but by that I mean as a discrete activity that happens amongst the panoply of things that you do. So I'm interested in, Elvira, when you were, invited to do the biennial in Göteborg. Was there a kind of list of requirements, list of programmatic requirements that you had to fulfill, and was an education program automatically part of that? Presumably so.
I mean, I think yes, you are right in that, but I will expand your question to sort of like try to see that for me, also bringing to the biennial what I wanted to do, both through the program, which I didn't want to do the typical parallel program. There were many initiatives that happens in the space, workshop that I didn't mention, but also, this series that for me was very important, using a methodology that Lulu Sherinetti initiated. But to me, one thing that I wanted to say that is the education also starts with the institutions. Like I felt like in a way I needed to educate the institution in Gothenburg, and I hope they don't feel bad when I say this, because I think in a way they were expecting me to do an African show somehow. And there was and there is a need to also to go beyond the limitation of the fifth category where people can see you as a curator, right? So my idea was to even to think about the space of the exhibition as an open work, no? The space of exhibition as a participatory experience, the educational aspect of the project as a participatory experience. So I changed the model that they used to work with, the way that they also work with local organizations, because we have, of course, a JIPCA extended, which was the so-called off program, right? But I will emphasize the fact that institutions also need to be educated. So it's not a department just for the public that comes to the institution, but also a way in which institution can be transformed.
Thank you. Well, but then that brings me to a question, and maybe this is aimed at you, Antonia, that what does the education program allow you to do that you can't do elsewhere in your other programs? I mean, is that, so, I mean, what I want to say is, I think at its very worst, the whole notion of an education program in an institution is kind of virtue signaling, right? And often, can kind of come down to sort of trite, sort of dumbing down often of, let's say, the content that's on show, because there's this idea that it's like, it's difficult and impervious, and therefore has to kind of like also be retranslated, descrambled, for a different kind of audience or something like that. I think that's, at its my most critical. That's where I would say I kind of sometimes have problems with education program. But you clearly think it's not ever only that, but much, much more. But could you talk about the liberatory space of what an education program is in your eyes?
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I liked what you said, before about the kind of demands of public funding. I mean, we're doing what we do in my context where I'm now because out of choice, I mean,
Exactly.
it's about a fundamental kind of thinking of how do you impact on a community or a society and not use the arts, but, and how do you build a kind of institution where the arts allow for those conversations to sort of take place. So, I mean, in a way, if you believe in that art is fundamental to society, then there's a kind of basic line there where you should give people access. So the whole kind of idea of the children's program and is also a kind of fundamental. I mean, I was being a bit sort of glib about it before, but I think there is a certain kind of urgency in working in a place like the UAE that doesn't necessarily have yet, although there are a lot of plans for it, a very pronounced arts education in schools and also where society is somewhat kind of stratified in terms of access to public space, and that public space doesn't, apart from the beach, or you could almost say the mall and some public squares and things, there's not actually so many spaces that are really kind of truly open to all. So, in terms of building an institution, that has to be very fundamental to our thinking. I mean, on the first day that we opened in November, we did a children's opening in the morning, and we had around 350 kids come. And, about at the end we said, who's been to a museum before? I mean, about 80% of them had never been. So then you kind of think, well, that's already opening a door to sort of thinking about things. But the role of education is kind of explaining the art. Yeah, I mean, that's not exactly primary to what we're thinking. And also you mentioned it as a kind of discrete line of programming, but I don't know if we really sort of see it like that, actually. I mean, there's obviously a team that works primarily on education, but the idea is to sort of take the institution as a whole and see it in terms of sort of concentric circles of learning. So the team is learning, from each other. You go out sort of these concentric circles until there's a constant process of renewing and rethinking, which is a kind of form of education, if you think of it as that sort of R&D lab kind of model.
Well, this is it. I want to, if a place is doing its job, maybe it doesn't need a discrete educational.
Right, but then it's
right?
about using that as a spark to take a much wider conversation. So if you think kind of, the context of here, a lot of people are kind of debating, where do I come from? What is my stake in this society? How are we going to kind of shape this together? And I mean, not to say that artists have to work in that way. Some very obviously open the door to those conversations. For others, it's much more kind of oblique. But as a kind of whole, the institution can begin to inspire those kind of conversations, and they can take place in that context amongst in a sort of state where artists are asking these questions in very complex kind of open-ended ways, which doesn't then simplify the kind of duality of do I belong or not, or where am I from or not, or where is my passport, or it enables those conversations to be far more kind of complex. So then that's the role of the institution alongside the role of the arts and the artist itself.
And I just wanted to add that, for instance, in the context of the showroom, communal knowledge had done that. You don't have a specific Department of Education. I mean, needless to say that the organization is very small, but the critical aspect is how much into the socially engaged practice the institution also intervene in the fact that they introduce as artists to the community, and we actually serve our locality, our community, and create a model in which artists and community work together for a project that then is developed in the space, whether it is at the end an exhibition, a workshop, or something else. No? And I think that is again has to do with what you're saying. No? Like I think we have a right to a stage beyond that, in which let's say the educational department per se has been somehow, in a way that Victoria was asking, no? Like embedded much more in a program that is taking more risk because it brings the experimentation, like in the case of Recetas Urbanas, to the architecture, to the space of the exhibition of the art project.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Elvira and Antonia? Over here, if you could keep your question short, sharp, and a question. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering about, we have these tiered education systems in institutions, especially museums, national art galleries and all. And those tiered systems are there to address, you know, those different concerns that you have. How do you feel that when we bring these tiered systems or think about them in realm of third world country art institutions, how valid they are, and how does that engagement reflect on what Shimon said about, you know, them being dysfunctional in maybe most the developed world institutions, you know, that tier system that exists.
Do you want to explain as quickly as possible what you mean by tiered system for those of us who don't know?
For example, when in a museum there are the children's programs for education, then there are youth programs for education, then there are artistic interventions and all that. So when we talk about education in an institution, it is a tiered system, and its importance on various levels is different. So
okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Antonia, Elvira?
I mean, I will say that both the example of ASICO, but also CCA as an organization already break, and of course the showroom, break that system. They become more permeable to the context where they operate. Particularly CCA Lagos respond to a particular need in Lagos at the time where BC started in 2007. But also I will say the showroom brings to a sense of collective and critical thinking that perhaps exists in a different way in academic setting, perhaps in London. No? It does so using both, let's say, the wide spread of possibilities in media that education offer, without being necessarily such a platform for education, right? Like, I see it in a expanded way. I see it in an almost like I'm adapting the notion of informality, that certain forms of more experimentation or sort of unconventional ways of producing platform of knowledge that had taken place in other parts of the world. No? MBC Silva's project is an example. As a way to operate then in a place like London, where there are formal spaces for such kind of education anyway. No? And just to going back to what you were saying in terms of the educational turn, no? Like perhaps we are seeing a way which already initiated with the institutional critique so many years, and perhaps we are in the third wave of it, in which exhibitions device help to bring, no, as you said, it's a Trojan horse for so many other initiatives that socially speaking had not space or not public space. No? And we claim it for this. What I'm much more invested in is how we can make what happened at the time and the experience of in the time and place of the artistic experience come out of that and really have an impact and affect change elsewhere. No?
Antonia?
Yeah, just to very quickly sort of second that, and also I think what you're bringing up also is about this necessity of different kind of models of different arts institutions. So quite often you will find in a city that the kind of big state model will maybe be dominant, but I mean, what's really important is to have these smaller, more flexible kind of organisations that can really be life-changing. And I'm thinking of kind of raw material company as well in Dakar, which Koyo Kuya, who's also another Global Art Forum alum speaker
Fellow.
friend, was involved with and set up. And again, that's if you'd never been to Dakar, you would imagine that raw material company is some kind of like gigantic institution because it's so influential. And then you get there and find it's 2 rooms, and it's kind of, but it has that capacity to really exact change. And the stratified nature of the programs, it doesn't always have to be like that. I mean, I guess it can be more mixed up. And I guess the third thing is just about this kind of precarious nature of trying to do things in spaces where there isn't state funding, and just that need to let things kind of run themselves and turn them over to the community. So even just thinking about CAD that time, and so I think when you were helping to run it too, where the participants themselves decided to set up their own grant-making sort of body and take on the running of it themselves. And maybe some of them are in the room now, I don't know. But they, and I thought that was just genius, because rather than sort of say to the institution, which was Art Dubai, we need you to keep looking after us, and what are we going to do next year? And we don't, tell us what to spend the money on. They said, we'll have that money, and we'll deal with it ourselves, and we'll give it out to our peers. And and then things start to sort of just run themselves, which is what you kind of eventually want to happen. Then you can
Ideally,
spawn more.
Spawn more. There are many other things I would like to ask you, but we have run out of time, and it's much better to end wanting more than feeling that you've had enough. And I think that's the sweet spot we're at now. So will you please join me in thanking Antonia Carver and Elvira Dyangani.